All right, it's 11. It's time. I think we can get ready to roll. Hi, everyone. I'm Bridget Escobar. I'm the president of CTR Payroll and HR, and we are now on round two of
Yeah.
our overview of the big, beautiful bill. We did a preview of what's coming, but we were all waiting with bated breath over the holiday to see what would happen, and it did indeed happen. So we are back to let you know of any changes. And for those of you who are like, I'm not even looking at this until this thing is something I have to deal with, we will hopefully give you the information that you need today. I also have on the meeting with me, I have Ann Lavelle, if you want to wave. Many of you know her. And then I have Stephanie Rodriguez as well from Compass. So many of you already know Ann, but we have a lot of participants here and some still rolling in. I would say this is our most attended webinar since COVID. So that tells you how important this information is today. So I figure there are some people who don't already know Ann. Ann is our compliance specialist at CTR. And Ann, before she came to us, she was a labor and employment attorney for a very large firm here based in Pittsburgh. And she has many years of experience. I won't say how many, I don't want to date you, but hear her
I appreciate that.
will know that she knows her stuff. And she did retire to be with her family. And I had a lunch with her out of the blue, hoping that we could hire her. And she said, I'm ready to get back in the game. And so here she is with us today, doing what she loves best, speaking and educating our clients. And then I also have Stephanie Rodriguez here today as well. And she's with our partner, Compass HR. Compass HR is a consulting firm, and we're very happy to have Stephanie with her expertise. Stephanie is a senior consultant with a strong track record for employee relations and compensation analytics, which we know is important with the new developments that we have today. So she's here to share her expertise. And we also have a special offer from Compass for our customers that can hopefully help you navigate these waters. All right, so Kara, we can move on.
Okay,
Okay.
sounds good. Thank you, Bridget.
Yep. And I did want to do a quick intro of CTR. So if you can, are you advancing the slides or is that?
Here, I will take care of that. So just, we'll get to the CTR slide in 1 second, but just so that everybody knows, this is recorded. You will get a copy of the recording and a copy of the slide deck. So you'll have everything you could possibly want. Just give us a little time to get that out after the webinar. Feel free to ask questions as we go along. Those of you who know me, just put it in the Q&A. I try to answer it as we go along. In the interest of time, if we're getting too many, like we did 2 weeks ago, where we got about 75 questions, I will stay as long as we need to get those questions answered, so that you walk away with the information that you need. But more importantly, to Bridget's point, here's CTR.
Yes, we don't always do this, but since we have so many new faces on this webinar, we wanted to at least give you an idea of who we are and what we do. There's a lot of things on the screen. I am not going to cover all this. Good for you. And very short and sweet elevator pitch. We offer the same level of technology, I would argue better, but it's personal preference, I suppose, as the national providers that many of you probably use today. So your Paycors, your Paylocities, ADP. We have a full HCM platform. We also offer a variety of services, which you can see here, and those services mirror the services that the national providers provide as well. What's really different about us is, for those of you on this call who are in the Pittsburgh area and in surrounding area, we are very familiar with the nuances and local taxes in Pittsburgh and the surrounding states. We also have an office in Florida. And then the other thing is that we're just very hands-on. So we have all this great technology, but it's no good to you if you don't have a team of professionals that can help you use the technology, that are responsive to you. We come on site. We're just a lot more hands-on than so we're told, than some of our big competitors out there. All right, next slide, Anne. We also just wanted to give you a little tease for our next seminar. So this is an in-person seminar. We have a QR code, and we'll be sending this slideshow out so you can register through the QR code. But this is very, very popular. It's cocktails and compliance. And you can imagine you get a lot of HR people in a room with a few cocktails. You can get some interesting conversation and commentary. So this is one of our more lively events. It will be August 12th. It's at Narcissi Winery, also one of our customers, from 3 to 6. And Anne, I just saw that you sent the slide deck over. So any tidbits on what you're going to talk about?
Oh, a little bit of everything. It's really a potpourri of information, but it's highlighting some of the things that have happened over the year and what we expect to come, as well as everybody seems to like war stories, particularly when they're drinking, I guess. So we'll talk about some war stories and where things went right, where things went wrong, and where things just went terrible. And hopefully that'll be a learning experience for those of us attending.
With that, Anne?
Let me dive right in then. So welcome back, everybody. I did not know you could max out the number of people on a Zoom webinar, but we have pretty much hit that today. So I'm glad there's so many people. I'm glad you're interested. Here we go again. We're covering the big, beautiful bill, which is now a law, but it sounds a lot cooler to say the big, beautiful bill still. So I'll refer to it as that. But it is in fact a law. So when we covered this a couple weeks ago to say, hey, here's a heads up, here's what's coming down the pike, we didn't know there was some gray area as to how it would apply. There was differences between the Senate and the House versions of the bill, because there always are, because they like to noodle over how they're doing things. But now we know with certainty how some of this is being applied. There's also still some gray areas, and we'll cover that. So for those of you who were on the webinar a couple weeks ago, you may say, hey, some of this is familiar, but be prepared because there are some finalization points that are new. There's some gray areas that are new, because with the law, you always have to have gray areas. And then what I think might be particularly helpful, given some of the questions that I've received within the last, since this was signed on July 4th, so the last 2 or 3 weeks here, I'm going to give some of our clients and some of the folks I've talked to an A+ for creativity as to how they're going to apply this. Maybe not an A+ for the legality of how they think they're going to apply this. So keeping in mind that lots of employers are looking at this law, the big, beautiful bill, and thinking about making changes to how they handle the compensation for employees. At the end, after we go over all the details of this, at the end, I've given 3 real life examples that I think would apply to a lot of employers on this call. Even if you have different positions and stuff, the concepts are the same. And we'll talk about how we would go about changing those, whether we should change them, what are the pros and cons to that, and how it would look. So the format for today is essentially to cover everything that's in the law that we're talking about, and then to apply it to some real world situations. A couple of disclaimers here that I always put out, because I always try to stay apolitical. I may make some dumb jokes now and then, but I am trying to stay apolitical. So we're not here to debate the merit of the law. That is Congress's purview. They have debated it. They've passed it. It's been signed. It is what it is. We're not here to discuss the full content of the law. We would be here for the next couple days if we were going to try to do that. And nobody wants to hear me talk that long. Trust me. We're here really to talk about 2 key points. And that's the no federal income tax on overtime and tips, and what that really means. Because everybody says, hey, no tax on OT and tips. And when they don't drill down, that includes your employees who are hearing this on the news and they're like, woohoo, no tax on overtime. And they don't drill down to really know what in the world that means for them. So there are a few employees who will, but a lot of them just hear that and they have expectations that exceed reality. So we need to set their expectations accordingly as well. Okay, with that being said, let's move on. So the first question, and we covered this a couple weeks ago, and it has not changed. What taxes are we talking about? Only federal income tax. Social Security and Medicare taxes, which are applied by the federal government, are still in effect. So to the extent that it's not being taxed, it's a narrow bandwidth sort of thing that we're saying, hey, is not the tax. Only the federal income tax is gone on overtime and tips. Social Security and Medicare taxes still apply. And really importantly, this is key, particularly for tips, state and local taxes still apply. And we'll talk about why that's key in a little bit here. So yes, there is no income tax, federal income tax on these items, but all the other taxes still exist. And that's a point that a lot of employees don't appreciate, because all they've heard on the news or wherever is no tax on overtime and tips. They don't understand what the overtime piece is either. And we'll talk about that as well. So keep that in mind, and your employees may need some education as to what that means before they get their first post-bill paycheck and somebody says, hey, I've been taxed. You need to be able to explain to them, yeah, you have been taxed because only one type of tax is eliminated here. So we have a question already, and it says, is there a limit on the amount of income for the no tax on tips and overtime at the federal level? Yes, and I have a slide on that because that was a subject of debate between the House and Senate as to how they were going to either cap how much a person could earn or how much overtime or tips could be subject to this exemption. So I have a slide, so that's coming up, but you are right. There are limits or caps and phase outs with respect to this. So I will get to your question in about 2 minutes here. What tax years does this apply to? It's a short-term provision. So that's important to recognize too, because a lot of your employees who are running around all excited may not realize that there's a sunset provision to this at the end of 2028. So it's a short-term provision. And that's important for employers too. So everybody on this call, if you're thinking about changing how you pay employees, and we'll talk about why there's good reason to do that, because this gives you a nice opening, especially in some cases to do that, where it may need to be done anyway. You need to keep in mind that if you're changing them to a different payment methodology, that this benefit with respect to taxes is short-lived. And so that means, do you change it back in 2028? What are you going to do? You know, are you just going to let it ride and say, hey, we're changing them. We're going to hope for the best. Maybe they'll make this permanent in 2028. Maybe not. Maybe the next administration will keep it going. Depends who's in power, right? Whether that might be a reality. You know, are you going to retire by the time 2028 comes around? You'll be in Hawaii, so you don't care. It'll be the next HR person's problem. Lots of thoughts along that. So, okay, so we have another question here that you guys are anticipating some of my slides, but let me answer this real quick. It says, are employers required to report only overtime as defined and calculated under the FLSA? For example, if an employer offers double time overtime, which goes above and beyond the FLSA required calculation of overtime. So obviously, I think the question here is really geared towards, will this benefit apply to the double time? Obviously, we always report all income that the employee is getting, whether it's because we're being generous and doing double time, or as we'll cover in another slide, some states require double time or time and a half after less than 40 hours. None of that counts as overtime that's going to be exempted. Only overtime that's required under the FLSA gets this perk, if you will. We'll call it a perk. The time that you're being extra generous about and saying, hey, I'm going to pay double time because it's a holiday, or it's the weekend, or it's the night shift, whatever it is that you're paying double time for, that additional amount beyond the 50% that would normally be required as overtime doesn't get this perk. Okay, so let's move along here. Who's eligible? And I do see I have a ton of questions coming in. So let me get a few more slides in here under my belt so I'm respectful of everybody's time, and I promise I will stay on as long as needed. Who's eligible for this? Well, basically you need a social security number, and so does your spouse. Assuming you have that, you're going to be eligible. We'll, again, talk about the caps and the phase outs. But you may recall from a couple weeks ago when we talked about this, that the caps and the phase outs were different depending on whether you looked at the House version of the bill or the Senate version of the bill. So the winner is, everybody do a drum roll here. More or less it was the Senate version that won. So the deduction for either overtime or tips starts to phase out when a single filer earns more than $150,000. For a married couple, it starts to phase out at $300,000. And for a single filer, the benefit of this is completely gone if they're earning more than $250,000, which kind of makes sense because this was meant to help middle class, lower income folks. By the time you hit $250,000 in earnings, you're probably doing okay as it is, and this is not a benefit that's meant to help you. So let's move on here. So for tips, the question was, is there a deduction limit? Yes, it's $25,000. So that's a lot of tips. But you can deduct up to $25,000 in tips. Really important to remember that tips are a voluntary payment as defined by the FLSA. It is not a mandatory service charge. So you've got to be careful that a lot of restaurants, a lot of places, because of the inflation and other things that we have seen, are putting service charges on the bill for whatever reason, you know, the price of eggs or whatever it is. And that does not count as a tip that will get this type of perk. The other thing to remember, and isn't going to sit well with some of your employees, is right now, the government is defining tipped workers as those who are in an industry that's customarily and regularly tipped. And the government recognizes two industries right at the moment, food service and beauty. What about everybody else, right? I can think of a whole bunch of people who I tip that aren't on this list. You know, the delivery driver, the personal shopper who gets my groceries at one of the mega grocery stores in town. You know, all those people I tip, but are they going to count? And we don't know the answer to that yet. That's a gray area. So the problem is the IRS that has been instructed to list other professions that are customarily and regularly tipped beyond food service and beyond beauty. We don't know what they're going to come up with. And that's a bit of a problem because you're going to have employees that are like, hey, why am I not getting this break? Why am I not getting this perk? And right now we don't know what to do with it. This law is retroactive to the beginning of this year. So not sure how it's going to play out, how quickly. Hopefully within 90 days, we'll have some information on this, but there's no certainty within the government. They often set deadlines for themselves that don't quite happen or work out. Okay, so somebody asked, and this is a good question, is our company offers PTO and holiday, is that included in the calculation of overtime? Does this count? So just generally speaking, this has nothing to do with the big, beautiful bill. Overtime typically only looks at actual hours worked. So if you had a situation where a person worked 40 hours and then took 8 hours of vacation, you wouldn't have an overtime situation in at the federal level. At least you could at some states, but generally at the federal level under the FLSA, you don't have an overtime situation because the actual hours worked were only 40. that 8 hours of OT wasn't actual, or I'm sorry, 8 hours of vacation or sick or PTO or whatever you want to call it, wasn't actual hours worked. So just in general, we wouldn't be looking at that. So this law defines overtime as it's defined in the FLSA, which only counts actual hours worked. And so that overtime wouldn't be paid for those 8 hours of vacation or sick time because we don't have more than 40 hours actually worked within that work week. So I hope that answers the question there. All right, so hopefully we'll get a full list of jobs. I also want to point out that the no tax on tips applies to independent contractors and 1099 folks. A lot of you have heard me whine and complain about 1099 folks, that they're often misclassified employees. So I'm going to put that warning out there again. This is not an independent contractor seminar and the dangers of independent contractors who are misclassified, but I would be remiss if I didn't point that out. So A, make sure that they're truly 1099 folks, and B, if they're getting tipped, they could be eligible for this perk if they fall into one of the appropriate job categories. Okay. For overtime, it's slightly different. So the deduction limit, right, for tips, it was $25,000 a person. For overtime is $12,500, $25,000 for joint filers. What type of overtime? And this is where a lot of your employees misunderstand this. It's only the premium portion. So I put a really basic example here because I need basic math in my life at my age. And I appreciate that Bridget did not reveal how long I had practiced law, but let's just say I have more than a half century under my belt at this point. So not practicing law, just of trying to get through life, but it's the extra 50%, right? It's time and a half. So if my regular rate is $10, again, nobody's probably paying $10, but keeping the math simple for me, the premium on that is $5. We're going to pay the person $15 an hour, 10 of which represents the regular rate and $5 of which represents the premium. Only the $5 gets this no tax perk, not the whole 15. That's going to throw some of your employees for a loop when they get their first paycheck that you might be doing under this. So this is an educational opportunity, particularly if you have folks who regularly and consistently work overtime, which, as you can see in my next bullet point, is not that many. So while there's almost 100 million people in the US that are eligible for overtime because they've been classified as non-exempt, either non-exempt hourly or non-exempt salaried. Yes, you can have non-exempt salary. Regularly working overtime is only about 12% of that number. Now that's given 100 million people, that's still a lot of people. But for a lot of people, this is going to be far and few between as to whether or not this is even going to help them on a regular basis. Again, we covered this in the question that was asked, which was a really good one. That in that question, the company was voluntarily offering double time in certain situations. I don't know what those situations were, but that's a pretty common thing. Holidays, nighttime, whatever, weekends. But some states, particularly out west, require either double time or time and a half after so many hours, less than 40. So there's some states that say, hey, if you work more than 10 hours in a day, you get time and a half. Doesn't matter how many hours you work in a week, you're still getting time and a half on Monday if you work 12 hours. That's not the time that is counted for this. Any state mandated overtime that's different than the FLSA, any employer generosity with respect to overtime is not counted with respect to this perk. It's only the time that would be required under the FLSA, Section 7 of the FLSA, as overtime that it gets counted for this perk. Something I want to point out, this is another gray area, thanks to our government. So last time when we did this webinar a few weeks ago, I got a lot of questions about, well, what do we do about the first 6 months of the year? We've already paid it. What do we do? You know what? I didn't know what we did because we didn't have any guidance on it. Guess what? I still don't know quite what we do because we still don't have a lot of guidance, but we have a promise out there. So the law says that for 2025, employers may approximate an amount designated as the overtime premium by any reasonable method specified by the IRS. Problem is, we don't have those methodologies yet, but we will get them hopefully again within 90 days. I'm not sure how that's going to look. This is a situation where we say, okay, moving forward, we recognize that the federal income tax doesn't necessarily apply to the overtime premium as calculated under the FLSA, but how we're handling this on a whole year basis, because again, this came into place 6 months into the year, we have to wait to find out. So keep your ear to the ground. We have some comments coming in here. And questions. So one person said, I work in public sector with a lot of union contracts. Absolutely, a lot of union contracts that are more generous in overtime rules. Those union contracts don't count either. So the law is very, very clear, surprisingly. A lot of laws are gray, and very specific that the only overtime that counts, again, is the overtime that would be required under the FLSA, which is time and a half after 40 hours. So that 50% premium after 40 hours of actual work. The fact that the union contract is more generous is irrelevant. So those guys and gals who are working under the union contract may need educated because they may be under the misapprehension that, hey, I get overtime every day when I work more than 8 hours. This is great. I'm going to really make out on this. And they're not, because we're only looking at a subset of the overtime with respect to this tax break. Okay, what if overtime is calculated on a daily 8-hour workday, not on a 40-hour week basis? So again, we have the same exact issue. And I love these questions because I really appreciate them, because it shows what your issues are. And it's a great learning experience for all of us to talk about this. Again, if you're an employer that's being more generous, right, and calculating overtime, either because you have to, because of a state law, or because you're just kind and generous and this is how you work things once the person hits 8 hours in a day, they get overtime. If they don't hit more than 40 in a week, they're not going to get this perk. So again, it's only as you calculate the FLSA overtime. Okay, so I think I have covered a lot of these. Let me circle back here to some slides. And we are getting a ton of questions.
There was a question about what CTR would be doing to help report this information. And so the qualified overtime compensation has to be reported as a separate line item on the employee's W-2. So I mean, we are still waiting for guidance. This is the theme from the IRS, but that is something that we will be working with all of our clients, and we'll be reaching out and assisting you with that. Obviously, you're going to need a way to track overtime if you're not doing so already. And, you know, those mechanisms are in place for our customers. So assuming that you have it tracked, we will be able to accurately report it on the W-2.
Yeah, and Bridget, that's a great point. One of my slides coming up talks about the IRS is supposed to be redoing some of its forms to better track this information. Again, we don't have those forms yet. Just to cover another question or two that I saw while Bridget was talking, do you know if drivers' overtime counts, delivery trucks, etc.? So yeah, it counts as long as it would count under the FLSA, the Fair Labor Standards Act. So if it's more than 48 hours in a week at time and a half, it counts. It does not matter the type of job that they have. Let's see here. What about salary? But we also do hourly jobs for the same company, but get straight time since it isn't part of the salary job. Do these get exempt since they are over 40 hours a week? Wow, that's a mare's nest right there. I'm going to save that question. That's a great question that has a lot of components to it to the end here. But let's wait on that because that's such an involved question. So I will get to that at the end here. Okay.
And one more, just with, are some employers planning to withhold taxes differently at the time of payment? And employers are supposed to continue to withhold federal income taxes on all overtime wages through the end of 2025. Then we'll receive guidance on how to adjust withholding procedures going forward. So this is what we're hearing, but again, still waiting on some guidance there. Okay.
Yeah, and that
your flow, Anne.
Oh, no. I appreciate the input. This made a more dynamic discussion. I appreciate the thoughts here because we do have a gap right at the moment with the IRS saying, hey, we are going to give guidance on this, but we're already half a year into it. And the guidance is supposed to come out within 90 days. That may or may not happen. Don't hold your breath. But we're in a little bit of a quandary right at the moment. So some employers are going to be, or some employees are going to be disappointed when they don't see the first paycheck that says, hey, something different is happening here. Okay, moving along. What are some action items? Well, we've talked a little bit about this. Employers are still responsible for reporting and withholding. Makes sense, right? Only tips and overtime that are reported are eligible for this. So we covered this a couple weeks ago, but I want to hit on this again. So employees have been known, despite the law, to not report their tips. That's illegal. They're not supposed to do that. But let's talk about that because there's a reality to this situation as well. That some employees, somebody hands them cash and they put it in their little apron pocket as a server and you never hear about it. That's, again, illegal, not what's supposed to happen, but it happens. So if they report it now, one of the big questions out there is, are they going to? Are they going to report this because they think, wow, it's like tax-free income, this is great. But at the same time, if they're savvy or if they're educated, they will recognize that they will get taxed. So they went from a situation where they were acting illegally, but not getting taxed at all on the cash tips to a situation where they won't get the federal income tax, but they will get the Medicaid and state taxes. And will that actually hurt them compared to what they were doing, which granted was illegal? So we may not see a lot of people reporting the tips as much as we would hope or as much as they should, because if they're savvy, they're going to recognize that they may actually lose on this if they report the tips. They'll go from no taxes to Medicare, Social Security, and state taxes. And if they do report it, we ought to be on the lookout to say, well, gosh, does this cause us any issues if Anne's tips went from 2,000 last year to 20,000? That looks a little funny, right? And so does that open the door for audit issues for either the employee or the employer? That's a question mark out there, but it is something to be cognizant of, especially if you see a big jump in tip reporting, that somebody's like, wow, I'm going to take advantage of this. I was pocketing all the cash illegally, but now I'm going to report it. So just something to be aware of as this sort of evolves. And of course, you're supposed to identify the overtime that's subject to this perk and tips separately from the other income, which you should be able to do. And again, the IRS is supposed to be updating their forms to show you how this is supposed to work, which of course we don't have. All right, does this actually help anyone? So depending on the sources you look at, and I try to look at both what I'll call liberal and conservative sources and get the information from both, about 25 to 40% of tipped employees don't earn enough for this to even count because the standard deduction wipes out any tax liability that they might have. Other folks don't benefit as much from this because they have tax deductions that are applicable to them that reduce their tax liability, such as the child tax credit. This doesn't help the very lowest wage earners. It doesn't help the folks with a lot of deductions. So depending on the source you look at, This is likely going to save a worker who doesn't fall into those categories somewhere between 1,400 and 2,000 a year. That's still good, right? But it's not going to help the very lowest or the folks with a lot of deductions. So that's an education point as well for employees. There's more of a potential, and these are sort of the examples that we're going to look at in a few minutes here, for reshuffling employees or changing them under this law from exempt to non-exempt to take advantage of this perk. I'm going to caution you guys all up front here because this is one of the biggest problems. If you had somebody who was exempt, not used to keeping their time, and you change them to non-exempt so that they get the perk of this law because they'll be earning overtime, you really need to track all hours worked. That includes the phone call that the formerly exempt person took at, 7 o'clock at night because they're a good employee and they want to help the business and they didn't mind taking the 10-minute call. All of a sudden that's compensable. Whereas when you had the salary, it covered everything, right? You didn't need to track their hours. There's an expectation oftentimes with exempt employees that they work beyond 8 to 5 and everything's just covered. You don't need to worry about it. Not so if they're now non-exempt. And that's a cultural mindset shift for that employee as well as the employer with respect to that employee. So do keep that in mind. We do have, and this will lead into Compass, a horizontal equity issue here that I think employers really need to be sensitive to. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, but you're going to have situation where workers earning the same are treated differently depending on classification and how they are paid. And we'll talk about that in some of the examples, but you can have situations where the non-exempt frontline employee could do better than their supervisor on certain things because the supervisor is exempt, but the non-exempt frontline employee is not, and they're getting this benefit on overtime. That's not going to make some employees very happy, right? And so we need to think about that and talk about that because it's a tough job market out there in most professions, so you have to keep in mind employee morale, recruitment, competition for employees. If you're paying somebody on an exempt basis and they're not getting this perk and your competitor is willing to pay them on a non-exempt basis, and again, we'll go over an example, what am I going to do as the employee? I'm going to move to the competitor probably. So we have to be thoughtful about this horizontal equity issue and how it looks with respect to competition for these employees, that a competitor might be paying them in a way that will allow them to take advantage of this law and you're not. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie for a few minutes here.
Thank you, everyone. Stephanie with Compass. Yes, this is a really good setup into where Compass, or how can Compass support you. So obviously this training, this webinar has been heavily focused on the tax implications and how you work that piece. But as described just previously, before we get to that, the question is, are your employees classified correctly? Are their job descriptions accurately describing what they're doing, and are they being compensated properly, i.e. hourly versus salary exempt versus non-exempt if you have you. So being a partner of CTR, Compass already has access to all of your CTR data in the event that you were to be partnering with Compass. And so as part of this training and webinar, we're doing a special wage analysis audit package or service, a part of the big beautiful bill for any of the CTR clients. And basically it's to help you, as described on this slide, is let's look at your organization first, specifically anyone with those hourly workers, the tip staff, and your job profiles that might fall into the FLSA classification gray area is what we call that, where to the point earlier, you're paying people the same amount but differently. Why is that? What is it about the job itself that's dictating the proper classification? Are they classified incorrectly, correctly? You may have employees now that are going to come back on either side asking, why am I not paid overtime today? or how can I not be and become salaried if you have you? And if you are not prepared to answer those questions, if you are not prepared to properly provide sufficient data or explanation, if you will, that's where Compass can come in. So part of this wage analysis audit is we can review up to 5 positions and descriptions. And I want to be really clear what we mean by the 5 positions specifically is it's not that we're going to look at the entire workforce or like the number of impacted employees. It's what are these positions, and then based on these positions, how many people fall into them. So there's various pricing structures that we can share with you guys, but it'll be a review up to 5 positions in your job descriptions, an audit of your wage history for those roles. We will provide a recommendation on the proper classification if you fall specifically into that gray area where it could go either way, or you may or may not already be starting to be questioned by your workforce. Creating a cost analysis of the financial impact to the employee and the organization, looking at a 12-month back data. So it might make sense to switch someone to non-exempt from exempt or vice versa. And also, going back to the whole communication piece, will help you customize a communication plan for anyone that may be impacted and what that change management strategy on how to deliver these news, good, bad, and different, before you start diving into the specifics of the tax implications. So feel free to ask any questions regarding this special package that we have going out now or after the presentation. CTR will route all your questions to me, and you can always visit us at wearecompass.com and a little bit more information about our firm and the services that we offer outside of the specific package regarding to the big, beautiful bill. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie.
Absolutely.
So I was looking at a couple of questions as Stephanie was talking, trying to get ahead of the curve here. So somebody said, why in the world would you want to change anybody from exempt to non-exempt? I think we'll cover that in the examples coming up here. This could actually be a boon to you, particularly if you have folks who are misclassified, but there's other reasons too. And that is essentially if the pay structure looks better under this law, you might want to change them as a retention, and so that you don't get folks cherry picked off by other employers who are willing to be more flexible and change their employees' pay structures based on this law, even though it has a sunset in a couple of years. Somebody also raised the good point that a lot of tips now are on credit cards, so it's harder to hide. Yeah, I agree totally with you. It is much harder to hide. In fact, I'm one of those people who walks around with a credit card and no cash. And if I actually need cash, it becomes a panic moment for me in my life. So yeah, I agree with you. It's harder, but there's still a subset out there. And it depends too on the type of business you have, how maybe upscale or not upscale it is, whether you're more or less likely to have some of your tipped workers paid in cash. But yeah, your point's well taken that a lot of it is on credit cards and harder to hide at this point. So diving back in here. So let's make this real, okay? And we'll talk about why we might, and I know we have more questions coming again, but let's talk about a real life situation and why this actually could be very, very beneficial to you to use this law to your advantage as an employer, particularly if you have not looked at your classifications in a while, or as many employers have, folks who are in a gray area. That is incredibly common. And, when I was a partner in a firm, the harsh reality is sometimes attorneys can't give you a firm answer that, yes, this position is exempt or non-exempt because you're in a gray area. And then it becomes a risk judgment as to whether we're going to let this person be exempt or non-exempt. So we have Meredith Mason here. She's known on Discord, which is a server, according to my kids, as the Mass Effect Commander Shepard Game Master. I'm told that sounds really cool if you know the game Mass Effect. So I personally am not cool, but I try. So she's a first level supervisor. She's an assistant manager at the Global Gaming Store, and she loves the PS5. It's a great job. Back in the 1980s, and I'm not kidding you that when I was a partner and I did practice for almost 25 years, we would have this situation more frequently than I care to remember, where somebody had a company handbook that hadn't been reviewed since the dark ages. So my little example here, it hasn't been reviewed since the 1980s, which I'm told is the dark ages, even though I lived through those dark ages. At the time when the employer set all this up, they did not really have anyone look at who should be exempt or non-exempt. They didn't talk to legal counsel. They didn't talk to an HR consultant. They didn't even, question the owner's dog, who's a pretty smart collie back then. It might have helped them if they had, but they hadn't. And also things change over time, right? The law evolves. And so if you haven't looked at classification in a while, and don't even mean classification with respect to this bill, just in general, you probably have an issue out there. So this has worked out really well for the company, especially over the holidays, with retail hours being long and difficult. And so they didn't have to pay overtime because she was an assistant manager. We all know all managers are exempt and didn't have to pay overtime. Now, here's our first problem. And here's where we have an opportunity. So many employers have misclassified assistant managers or first level supervisors that should be non-exempt to begin with. And I can almost guarantee you that Meredith here is one of them. Because what does a first level supervisor or assistant manager do in most retail stores or most settings like this, or even factories? They're doing the exact same work that the frontline non-management people are doing. They're operating the cash register. They're helping customers find the games, whatever. That's not an exempt person. So here's your opportunity, because a lot of times when employers discover they have a mistake like this, and almost all assistant managers are mistakes if they're exempt, I won't say 100%, but most, they're like, well, gosh, if I change it now, don't I send up red flags? How am I going to explain my mistake away? Here's your opportunity to hang it on the big, beautiful bill and say, look, we've reclassified you so that you can get the tax perk on the overtime. And yes, we will now pay the overtime as we should have been doing since probably the dawn of time here. And we can make the employee perhaps happy, and we can fix the legal problem that we have at the same time. So why would I ever want to switch somebody from exempt to non-exempt? Because maybe I've got them messed up in the first place. And that's a very, very common issue. So there's some employees that are blatantly misclassified. Most assistant managers probably fall into that category. But there's others who are truly a gray area. And maybe you have noodled over whether or not that person should be exempt or non-exempt. And you eventually made the decision, hopefully with legal counsel or an HR consultant, to say, you know what, I'm going to take the risk because I only have one person in that position. It's not like I have 100. That would be a class action lawsuit. And I'm going to take the risk and make them exempt because they really don't work that much overtime anyway. For those folks as well, this is a great time to reconsider life and say, do I still want that risk metric whenever I might benefit them and lead to employee retention, right? Because maybe my competitor is willing to hire my assistant manager, who's a great employee and clearly knows all the games for the PS5, away from me, even if she was legitimately in a gray area. So now's the time for me to leap on this, hang my hat on this law and change somebody. And it's also a horizontal equity issue, because we also have working in the store, Teenage Tim. We all know them. I've got a son that's Teenage Tim, I think. So Tim is the non-exempt employee, and Meredith doesn't like him that much. He's an Xbox fan. He takes all the shifts he can get because he's saving for his new dirt bike. This becomes important in the next example. Meredith does the math. No, not the new math in the schools, the old-fashioned math. And she calculates that he will earn more during the holidays than her because he's going to get the benefit of this. I am certainly not going to throw out a math example right here, right now, because that would take too long and is beyond my scope of expertise. But this is a horizontal equity issue, right? They're basically doing the same job. She's probably misclassified in the first place, but even if she wasn't, if she was legitimately classified as exempt, you're going to have an issue. She's going to be teed off that she's earning less than teenage Tim, who's just bebopping around the store. And she probably has more responsibilities anyway, because she is the assistant manager. And that's not going to lead to a happy employee, whether she goes somewhere else or not. That's a morale, a retention, all sorts of issues there. Okay, let's move on. I will take the rest of the questions at the end because we are running tight on time and I want to make sure we cover all these examples. But again, I will stay focused on, I will stay here to focus on the questions after this. So we have Nancy Nurse. So I kind of touched on this a few weeks ago. So those of you who were here a couple weeks ago for the preview may remember this, but this is an important item to talk about. So Nancy Nurse, she's a great hospital worker. She takes all the shifts she can get because she's a single mom. There's a nurse shortage. She's saving money for teenage Tim to go to college, and she just hopes he doesn't take the dirt bike route. But in any event, she's done the math. She can't believe her luck. Let's hope she's educated on how she did her math, that she only did it on the overtime premium. And she thinks this is just the best thing since sliced bread. She tells her nursing floor supervisor, Sally, how excited she is that she's going to get this extra windfall, essentially, because of this new law. And Sally then does the numbers and realizes that Nancy's better off than Sally. Sally's the supervisor. Sally does work just like Nancy, plus all the supervisory work. Now, I'll tell you, this is a very different example for anybody who's saying, oh, please, you're putting me to sleep. This is the same example that you just did. It's not. Nurses, because of their additional education, when we look at RNs and BSNs, are almost always exempt with respect to duties. It's how you pay them that determines whether or not they'll meet the FLSA exemption of a professional. So in Sally's case, it doesn't matter that she's doing the same work as her subordinate, because we're not talking about the executive exemption like we were in the prior example. We're talking about the professional exemption. The only reason that Nancy's non-exempt is because we pay her hourly, which is very common in this town to do that. Even though if we paid her salary, we could make her exempt. It's just our culture and our standard way we do things in the healthcare industry that we pay Nancy an hourly rate, and her supervisor gets the exemption, not because of her duties, but because they're the same as Nancy's with a little extra added on, but because we pay her a salary that would meet the salary thresholds under the FLSA. How do we potentially change this to make Sally happy? What if Sally says, I want to go back to being a floor nurse, forget the supervisory stuff. I want the benefit. And if you don't let me do that, then I'm moving down the street because there is a nursing shortage and I'm going to XYZ healthcare location. We can pay Sally hourly. We can change her, or we can make her salaried exempt or salaried non-exempt, excuse me. Too much exempt, non-exempt. Either way, we change her because we're paying her hourly, she's no longer exempt and she gets the perk of the overtime. It's not that we've changed her duties or anything else that she's doing. We changed the second part of the FLSA test for exemptions. We're paying her hourly. We're not paying her on a salary basis anymore. That is something to consider. If we don't want to see an exodus of people, and we think we might have that problem, that's something to consider. We don't change the duties. We change the payment methodology. So even though they could be exempt based on their duties, if we pay them hourly, they automatically become non-exempt. It is what it is. Now, with that, we go back to my caution of a few slides ago that you have to be really careful about the timekeeping because Sally's maybe not used to doing this anymore. And we need to make sure we count for all actual hours worked by Sally so that we, aren't missing time, that we don't have some situation with Sally where we have missed the time and she claims non-payment and whatever. Track those hours, track the hours, make sure she's tracking the hours. That's the biggest danger with that one. Okay, last example here. Valet Vince, along with delivery driver Dan, the hotel maid, the Uber Lyft person, and my personal shopper over at the grocery store, who saves me from having to walk around the grocery store looking clueless for 2 hours, have all read about the no tax on tips. Okay, they didn't really read it. They read the headline and they didn't drill down because the news article flashed on Insta. I'm told that if I say Insta rather than Instagram, that makes me look cool too. Let me know in the comments whether you think that's true. But they say, hey, this is great. No tax on tips. I'm going to make out here on this little perk. They couldn't be bothered to read the whole article because, you know, they might miss a reel or something. It's a 2-minute read. That sounds too long for the 30-second attention span. And they can't wait for this perk. Do you have an HR headache? Yes, you do. So I think you keep your ear to the ground on this one. You listen to see if the IRS includes some of these people. I think delivery drivers are almost a no-brainer, but that's me, not the IRS. Doesn't matter whether they're employees, 1099 folks, or or self-employed. Maybe this will benefit them, depending on what the IRS says. But in the meantime, I think they need some education to say, hey, you're not going to be as happy as you think you are unless the IRS broadens the classification from restaurant workers and beauty service folks, which beauty, by the way, includes hair, spa, nails, all that sort of stuff. That's fun to get. In any event, this is something, though, to think about. If you have these employees, right, you want to get ahead of the curve. And if you think these folks are likely to be included in the IRS guidance that they can benefit from this as a tipped employee, you might want to think ahead of saying, gosh, if right now I have delivery drivers who don't get tips, maybe I prohibit it. Do I want to change that so that they can get tips or whatever it might be? So think about those positions that are somewhat likely to be included in the IRS guidance and whether or not you want to tweak anything there because they might be eligible for tips. All right, just very briefly, because we're at the almost at the noon hour, and I will cover the questions I have. Just to know that your employees are impacted other ways financially. The child tax credit has increased and will continue to increase. It's tied to a metric now for annual inflation increases. The SALT deduction has increased, at least temporarily. There's some limitations on this. Also be aware, it's not all in the big, beautiful bill, although part of it is. There's now caps on the amount of student loans the federal government will give. And of course, garnishments are coming into effect. But the fact that there's limits on the amount you can borrow for student loans may drive people for looking for alternate sources of income to try to fund the all expensive college education for their kids. And so that's something just to be aware of, that your employees may have these pressures, these external pressures based on other portions of this bill. Bridget, I see you've joined us again. Did you want to wrap anything up and then I'll handle some questions here, or we can handle some questions? Oh, Bridget, I think you're muted. That's
Thank
okay. I talk to myself all the time.
After how many years on Teams, and you think I
No.
figured that one issue out. So I did want to just make a quick clarification. I saw one question and I'm thinking maybe some of our clients were thinking the same thing. Someone said, could you clarify what you had said earlier about Compass having access to our data through CTR? And I did want to clarify, and Kara did answer this one person, but I wanted to tell everyone that Compass does not have access to your data today. If you choose to work with Compass to go through some of this HR consulting analysis, you can request that Compass have access, and we give an authorization form, and then they can get access to the data to assist you with that analysis. I also wanted to mention for our customers, if you are thinking of transitioning some people who typically are exempt and you're moving them into a non-exempt status, we do have time and attendance if you're not already using it. So we have methods to help you track the employee's hours. We can help you calculate overtime. If you have simple questions, of course, nothing seems simple with this, but if you do have questions about, tracking your overtime differently or tracking overtime for new classes of employees, by all means, reach out to us. We can help change overtime's overtime earnings codes. We can add codes for other employees. So you're not alone. You can reach out to us for those things and start with us and see if we can help. Okay, Anne.
Yeah, so we got a bunch. I'm sorry, Bridget.
I said,
Okay. We got a bunch of questions, so let me try to go through them. So great question here. Tips, it says it's voluntary. What if your employer has a mandatory tip for larger parties? Would that no longer be voluntary? That's correct. So usually, you know, you see restaurants that say, gosh, if you're a party of 10 or more, we're going to automatically add a gratuity of 18% or 20% or whatever it is. Under the IRS guidance and regulations, that's usually not considered a tip. That's considered a service charge because it is no longer voluntary. So that's an issue there, right? You might want to rethink that policy if you're trying to benefit your employees because, and that's true not just under this law, but just in general, if you're taking tip credits and paying your folks a substandard minimum wage, which you're allowed to do in tip situations, you need to be careful that you actually have voluntary tips as defined by the IRS and not inadvertently imposing service charges that look like a tip but really aren't. So great question there. Is there any liability to reclassifying someone, especially mid-year? So it doesn't matter what time of year you reclassify something. So the timing has no impact aside from your convenience and what might be good for you as an employer. The liability here would be that someone would recognize, hey, I was assistant manager Meredith Mason. And as I've looked into this, I've realized I was probably misclassified from the dawn of time until now. But you can't be an ostrich with your head in the sand and ignore that issue, right? If you now know Meredith, the assistant manager, should be non-exempt, you've turned an unintentional violation into an intentional one if you don't change her. So yes, you change her. The liability is not in changing her. The liability is that you were wrong for the last 2 or 3 years. And the statute of limitations is 2 or 3 years, depending on certain factors, whether there's intent or whether you should have known better and things like that. So if you change her, though, the longer you go before she gets upset and realizes there's a mistake or there was a mistake, you're knocking off time, you're knocking off liability, and you're not creating a situation where you had an intentional infraction of the law. So the liability is not on the timing. The liability is on what you've already done up to date and whether that was wrong to begin with. Okay, we have 2 guest services managers with the same responsibilities. One is exempt and one is non-exempt. The non-exempt employee limited their availability, but still meets the classification of a full-time employee, and therefore we changed it to non-exempt. Is that an issue? So the issue is not with the non-exempt person. The issue is the exempt guest services manager. So I don't know enough from this question to know whether she's going to pass the duties test. You can have people in the same job category where one is paid hourly and one is paid salaried, and one is therefore exempt and one is non-exempt, because maybe the one person wants to be part-time or whatever it is, which kind of sounds like what might be happening here to some extent. They've limited hours. But the question here is, do they have the right duties, right? As a manager, do they fit under either the professional, probably not, or the administrative or executive exemptions? And I can't tell from the question whether that's going to be true, but I will tell you, I'm cringing a little bit that these types of folks are usually at best in the gray area of whether or not they're exempt. So this is a situation where I would say, hey, somebody good needs to go look at their duties test and figure out if they meet the duties, which is well beyond the scope of what we can do here on a webinar. And then if they don't meet the duties, this is your opportunity to change them in a way that you can sort of spin it to make it sound, and hopefully it will benefit them in a way under this law. So little concerning. A guest services manager to me is very similar to an assistant manager, so I would be cautious of that. Okay, so in a nutshell, no tax on overtime deduction is an above the line deduction which reduces taxable income by the overtime amount up to 12,500 individually and 25,000 for joint filers. Those are the right caps. Yes, that's correct. Okay. Yeah, people are saying thank you. You're quite welcome. I'm glad it was helpful to you. Okay, would cleaners and non-medical home health aides factor in as well? For overtime, so I don't view either of those as tipped professions, janitorial or medical home health aides. But for overtime, absolutely. Anybody who's eligible for overtime under the Fair Labor Standards Act can take advantage of this and should, right? That it's going to be their perk. So it doesn't matter job, title, or classification. It's whether they're entitled to overtime under Section 7 of the FLSA. Okay, we have a comment here, and I've saved a couple of the more complex questions to last. We have drivers that are paid some sort of base wage or salary plus 3% commission on sales. Their overtime is based on days worked over 4 per week, 8 bi-weekly and not on hours. How would this be handled? So my first thought to you would I'd pick up the phone to Stephanie or legal counsel, because when I'm looking at this, I'm not quite sure drivers and how they're earning commissions. Like, are they selling something on their route? I'm just not sure. But I'm concerned that your pay structure currently might not meet the FLSA requirements, because for anybody who's compensated with I don't know if it's a base salary or base hourly rate that you have them on, but you count all hours in a single week, not a bi-weekly situation. So I would need to know more about this, but this is something I would look at more intently because I'm not sure you're set up correctly in the first place. Even forgetting about this law, I just think under the FLSA and state wage and hour laws, I would look at that more carefully. Let's hear. Okay, yes. So this benefit isn't seen right now per paycheck. You're correct. It's seen at the end of the year when they file, unless we get different IRS guidance, right? So the IRS has sort of floated the little carrot that we may be able to do this in any reasonable method that they bless, except we don't know what reasonable methods they're going to bless. So that is a bit of a gray area right at the moment. And I think it's an educational opportunity for your employees to say, hey, you know, you're not going to be as excited as you think right at the moment, because a lot of folks misunderstand this. Let me go back up to the one question, which I now, okay. So somebody asked a very complex question that I want to get to that says, what about salary, but also do hourly jobs for the same company, but get straight time since it isn't part of the salary job? Do these get exempt since they are over 40 hours worked? So let's put aside this law for a second. I think your pay structure is incorrect just to begin with. So when we have somebody who, and this comes up a lot, people need extra money. And so they turn to their current employer and say, hey, I do X, Y, and Z as maybe a secretary for you. And I work 40 hours and I get a salary for that. But I know you need extra cafeteria help on the weekends. And I'd like to do that. And there's some sort of straight time rate for that. The law says we actually, because I'm working for the same employer, we're going to combine the hours there and we're going to get an overtime rate. So if I work 12 hours in the cafeteria and 40 hours as a secretary, and this is well beyond my math skills right at the moment on a webinar, I'm going to somehow combine those rates. And there's a methodology within the FLSA, if you look on their website, to say, hey, we calculate sort of a blended rate. And because they've worked, it doesn't matter that they're in different positions. They're still the same. You're still the same employer. It's 52 hours in a single work week. You owe them overtime right now. So I think you need to be very cautious of that and relook at that regardless of this law And if you discover, as I think you probably will, that there may be a change that needs to be made with respect to paying overtime, and you have to figure out the blended rate and all that good stuff to figure out what the overtime rate is. This is a good time to do it, because then again, you can sort of say, hey, because of this law, we took a look and we're going to change it and we're going to make it this way. And now you're going to get the benefit of this law. So you have a very complex situation. It's one that is common though, because a lot of employers allow folks to pick up a second job with them, but it places additional obligations and burdens on your shoulders to do it correctly. And I'm not sure that's occurring right at the moment. Okay, we got a few more questions here. I think we're getting near the end though. And it says, okay, at my old job, I was exempt. We worked 45 hours. If we worked more, they would pay us by the hour. But all hours were doing exempt jobs. Same scenario or different. So it depends on how, that certainly muddies the water. I think that the employer could have handled that pay structure a lot better to confirm that everybody was exempt rather than paying some hours on an hourly basis. However, if I was going to argue that on behalf of the employer, I would be like, hey, those hours were in the nature of a bonus of some type and were not reflective of whether the person was exempt or non-exempt. Does it muddy the waters? Yeah, absolutely. Will the FLSA investigator, the Department of Labor investigator, be like, what were you doing? Probably. But so while I would set that up differently, that doesn't automatically make somebody non-exempt if their duties were already exempt and if their base salary, right, the salary basis test, if their salary met the threshold and didn't change based on the quality or quantity of work performed. Okay. Oh, I think we have one last one here. Are you saying for a single person, their first 12,500 overtime pay is exempt from federal tax? And only if they earn more overtime, then that would it be applied? Little confused by the question. So the single person, we also look at their income, right? So for a single filer, they have to be earning 150,000 or less, or it starts to fade out. But for overtime, yes, the only amount of overtime that will be given this perk, so to speak, is 12,500. That's the max. And if they earn more than 150,000 and are a single filer, it will actually be less than that. It starts to phase out as the person earns more money. So hopefully that helps. I think I have conquered all the questions, or at least tried to. So I appreciate it. Those who are saying thank you, you're quite welcome. Hopefully I've hit everything. If we haven't, please, you can always submit things later and be like, hey, Ann was blind. She missed my question. People here will believe that. So again, we will have the slides and the recording sent out to everybody, as well as the SHRM code for those of you who need the SHRM credit. And I appreciate everybody hanging in there today and working through this. And we will provide updates as we go along and hopefully get IRS guidance. So thanks, everyone. Bridget, anything else?
No, I think that's a wrap. Thank you so much, Anne.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Sounds good. Take care, everyone.